Hola mi gente, welcome to the Mano a Mano podcast. I'm George Laws Garcia, Executive Director of the Puerto Rico Statehood Council.
And I'm Martin Rivera, Director of Advocacy. In today's episode, we'll discuss key issues shaping the 2024 presidential election and how they connect to efforts to decolonize Puerto Rico. We'll also discuss the major announcement regarding the upcoming locally sponsored plebiscite in Puerto Rico, which is seeking to empower the voice of voters on the island to address the territory status issue. We'll discuss why this is important, how it relates to the Puerto Rico Status Act, and how you can support these efforts.
Later in the show, we'll also be joined by the former chairman of Puerto Rico's Financial and Oversight Management Board, Jose Carrion III. The board was instituted in 2016 after Congress passed the PROMESA legislation to address the island's fiscal and debt crisis. During the conversation, we'll discuss Puerto Rico's ongoing economic and fiscal reforms, what Puerto Rico is still working on to meet the requirements of PROMESA, and how it can increase competitiveness to achieve sustained economic growth. As an active Republican who participated in the recent RNC convention, we will also explore his views on how the ongoing transformation in the Republican Party may impact the legislative efforts to resolve Puerto Rico's status.
So let's get started.
All right, Martin, let's kick it off with some news and updates.
This week, Congress, the House, today's the last day of voting, and they're actually leaving early for August recess. The Senate is still scheduled to be here next week, but I wouldn't be surprised if after votes today, they might also call it in early. When it comes to issues in regards to the Puerto Rico Status Act, we've gained an additional co-sponsor in the House, bringing the total to 97 co-sponsors, and the latest co-sponsors, Representative Christopher DeLuzio from Pennsylvania. In the Senate, we still currently have 26 co-sponsors on that bill.
Have we heard anything about the possibility of the Senate hearing?
Yes, we've heard that it seems like it might be unlikely that it will occur here in July, but there is the potential for it to happen in September after the August recess.
Okay, great. And, let's kind of broaden the scope. What's happening in the 2024 general elections, and how's it connected to Puerto Rico?
The biggest news that come out this week is that President Biden has decided to drop out of the 2024 presidential race, and he has endorsed his Vice President Kamala Harris to be the nominee for Democrats. As of today, Vice President Harris has already received the endorsement of enough delegates to clinch the nomination, but it still needs to be voted on, and there's going to be a virtual roll call as soon as August 1st to actually name her the official nominee prior to the convention at the end of August in Chicago between the 19th and the 22nd.
And that's a huge shift, and I think the way that it interacts with our issue is that obviously President Biden had issued a statement of administration policy in support of the Puerto Rico Status Act. Martin, what do you think we could expect from a potential Harris administration?
I believe that several of the policies that the Biden administration has implemented, that they'll be continued along with the if Vice President Harris were to become president, she would follow several of the same policy initiatives. I know that she has been very integral into issues regarding to Puerto Rico. She recently went back in March to the island. So I believe that the work of the Biden administration, their policy, the statement of administration policy, will continue in a Harris administration were she to win the nomination, win the presidency.
I think that makes sense. So what about the Republican side?
Well, the Republicans also had a big news. They had their national convention in Milwaukee last week. And actually, George, I know that you were a little bit more acquainted as to what occurred in Milwaukee last week. Could you elaborate a little bit on it?
Well, the week was explosive, obviously, because President Trump survived a attempted assassination, which was shocking to the entire country, and something that we on the Mano a Mano podcast have to declare that we are explicitly against all forms of political violence. So we stand in alignment with that sentiment, and we definitely know that that's something that's shocking and absolutely cannot be permitted to go forward on any side of the political spectrum. For sure. So the RNC convention basically put forward the opportunity for President Trump to tout all of the policies that he's going to be pursuing if he's elected to the presidency. It was also the point where he revealed his candidate for vice president, which is U.S. Senator J.D. Vance from Ohio, a state that happens to have a significant Puerto Rican population and is one of the key states within the electoral college count that all of the presidential candidates are looking for to get to that 270 magic number in November. And then there's the issue of what happened with the Republican platform. So for the last 6 or 7 decades, Puerto Rico has been addressed directly by the Republican platform in a way where Republicans have recognized that there's a desire by island residents to resolve the Puerto Rico territory status, and they've also recognized the aspiration towards statehood. However, what we had in the RNC this past couple weeks was a wholesale redo of the entire platform.
Around 75 to 80% of the previous platform got basically nixed or redone.
Correct. So all kinds of issues that had been talked about in the platform were essentially left out. And Puerto Rico statehood and the need to resolve the territory status was one of them, which is obviously disappointing, but it's also not a transcendental thing. The platform did address directly the need to ensure that America continues protecting the U.S. citizens of Puerto Rico and talks about the importance of Puerto Rico and the other territories to America's national security. And I think where they leave the door open to the possibility of statehood is by indicating that all territories should have greater political participation in national politics.
Which you can only really attain through
statehood. Exactly. So for Puerto Rico, that's the only way to really attain that. And then there was something else that's really interesting that happened, which is within the RNC's actual rules, they basically set up some rules that foresee the possibility of Puerto Rico potentially being admitted to a state, and then it talks about how it would distribute the delegates before the next RNC convention if Puerto Rico becomes a state before then. So the RNC is literally envisioning that possibility and instituting rules to address it.
Right. So while it might not be in its face, there was still significant progress towards our issue of resolving Puerto Rico status at the RNC.
Definitely. So, Martin, tell us a little bit about the DNC platform, because we know that some work has been done there that's also related to Puerto Rico.
Yes, like I mentioned, the DNC convention is on August 19th in Chicago, but the Democratic National Committee already started working on their party platform. They actually released their draft 2024 Democratic Party platform, which had a significant amendment to the platform in regards to Puerto Rico status. In the past, there's been some vague language in regards to the Democrats support self-determination for Puerto Rico, like very overbroad, very vague.
And no one really knows what that means, right?
Right. So they narrowed their focus, the scope of what they mean, and they actually, I believe it was Luis Davila Pernas, I saw that he posted it on social media. He's the chairman of the Democratic Party of Puerto Rico, and he basically introduced this amendment, which basically states Democrats recognize that the people of Puerto Rico have earned and deserve to resolve the political status question. For this reason, Democrats support the enactment of the Puerto Rico Status Act, H.R. 2757 or S3231 in the Senate. And that's huge because that is the Democrats signifying, instead of the vague, very broad self-determination of Puerto Rico, they're endorsing specifically language that and a legislation that
has a direct offer of statehood
for Puerto Rico.
And it has a mechanism to implement that if the legislation is passed and voters ultimately choose that among the non-territorial options. I think that's really big progress, and I think it's a significant advancement. What about how things are shaping up on the island? Because I know we've had a really big announcement there. Talk to us about that.
So yes, on July 1st, Governor Pierluisi did mention that he was going to use his authority to do an executive order to actually implement an upcoming locally sponsored plebiscite, like we mentioned earlier. Basically, this plebiscite will be a reflection, at least the options presented on the plebiscite will be a reflection of the Puerto Rico Status Act as it passed the House last Congress, and it has been reintroduced in the House and Senate this Congress.
So it would include an offer of statehood, independence, or independence with free association.
Right. It just to go along with the House bill, the language is sovereignty and free association, but it's independence with a compact of free association, like we have with Micronesia, Palau, and the Marshall Islands. And one thing that we should keep in mind that this doesn't prevent the federal efforts to actually have a binding offer of statehood through any legislation. It doesn't prevent it from going forward. So the Puerto Rico Status Act can continue and still has the possibility of being enacted into law this Congress or the next. This upcoming plebiscite does not hinder. If anything, it bolsters those efforts to keep the voice of the people of Puerto Rico alive.
So personally, Martin, I think it's not just that the plebiscite doesn't prevent federal legislation for advancing. I actually think it does the opposite. I actually think it adds pressure to advancing this issue, because what it does is it sets up a circumstance where during the general election, voters in Puerto Rico will not only have the chance to vote for their elected governor, their resident commissioner, and their state legislature, but they'll also have the option to vote in the plebiscite to express what their preference is among the non-territory options. And then whoever's elected as president in the United States and to lead Congress and the House and in the Senate, they'll be confronted with the reality that voters in Puerto Rico have, for the fourth time in 2 decades, expressed themselves against the current territory status. And more likely than not, if what we expect to happen will happen on Election Day, that they'll choose statehood as their preferred option.
Mm-hmm. Like you mentioned, people don't realize that this century, the U.S. citizens of Puerto Rico have voted time and time again in favor of statehood, and this would just be an exercise of a legitimate exercise of self-determination to, again, demonstrate the voice of the people of Puerto Rico, how they wish their future political status to be, and to continue putting pressure on Congress to finally act. So we'll see how the voters go or how they choose, but it seems like the 2024 general election cycle on the federal level, and the state level, and in Puerto Rico is jam-packed. And in fact, we've even seen some interesting changes in local politics in Puerto Rico. Obviously, the parties in Puerto Rico are the PNP party, the Partido Popular, and the Independence Party. And one thing that I've just continued noticing in recent days is the drain of support from the PPD party going elsewhere on the island, either to the PNP party or to the Popular Party. One of the biggest supporters of the free association option, who I believe also ran for resident commissioner for the Popular Party, Rafael Costa, actually recently even endorsed Juan Dalmau, who's in the Independence Party, which shows you the weakening of the Popular Party on the island. And there's even been recent calls for the gubernatorial candidate, Jesus Manuel Ortiz, to even step down from the ticket. So
and I think that's significant, because it also shows that people are becoming more and more clear that you're either moving towards statehood or towards independence. One of the biggest issues in the minds of Puerto Rican voters in this electoral cycle is also about Puerto Rico's economy, as well as the progress that it's made under its fiscal reforms. We know that this has been a huge issue in Congress, where a lot of members, particularly on the Republican side, are always expressing concern about the possibility of resolving the status issue before Puerto Rico finishes its process of fiscal reforms. So one of the things that we're going to do during today's episode is actually bring in an expert on Puerto Rico's economy and Puerto Rico's fiscal reforms. His name is Jose Carrion. Jose Carrion III is an entrepreneur and insurance executive who has held prominent roles in Puerto Rico's financial services industry, working on both the public and private side. Additionally, Carrion was the first ever chairman of the Financial Oversight and Management Board under the Puerto Rico Oversight, Management, and Economic Stability Act, known as PROMESA. He was nominated by then House Speaker Paul Ryan and appointed by President Barack Obama to that position in 2016. He currently serves as a board member of the Puerto Rico Institute for Economic Liberty, a nonprofit think tank focused on promoting economic prosperity, free markets, and robust civic engagement. Carrion holds an MBA from St. John's University and a BA from the University of Pennsylvania. Welcome to the show. Jose Carrion, welcome to the Mano a Mano podcast.
Happy to be here. Thank you, George.
Thank you so much. Well, Jose, we greatly appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. And as a starting point for our listening audience, we'd love to get your feedback on the Fiscal Oversight Board and what that's about. We know that Puerto Rico has had the Fiscal Oversight Board now since 2016, and that it was approved as a result of the fiscal and debt crisis that Puerto Rico was experiencing back then. But we'd really love to hear directly from you, how this relates to Puerto Rico's territory status, what its responsibility is under PROMESA, and basically why it came about.
Sure. Well, so the board per se is just a vehicle. It's just an instrument that was impaneled um, due to bipartisan legislation in order to solve the debt crisis that we have in Puerto Rico. It became something else because of the political environment in Puerto Rico and the territorial status. But the reality is, there have been fiscal boards throughout the nation. We've had state-imposed fiscal boards in Michigan, in New York, and we've had federal imposed fiscal boards, control boards, which is more dramatic, in the federal capital in Washington, D.C. So it's just a vehicle in order to restructure debt because Puerto Rico had gotten itself into $120 billion worth of debt. Now, you have to understand that we knew, those of us that were going into this, we knew that it was going to be criticized as a territorial imposition and whatnot. But the reality is, it's just a vehicle because that was all that was available. For some reason, back in the 80s, at some point, Puerto Rico was left out of the bankruptcy code. I wasn't aware of why that was. The reality was that you had to do something in light of the situation manifested by the local, the territorial officials, and so the board was impaneled. It became a political issue. The territorial issue became nobody liked it, of course, because nobody likes impositions to begin with, and the people who favored independence saw it as a crass colonial imposition. And those people that favored statehood felt the same, although in a more mild manner. But the reality was that nobody cared for it, and we understood that because you were there to take action on things that could be problematic, but needed to be done in order to get fiscal sanity back into our finances. So I just viewed it always as a vehicle, in whether or not you wanted independence or whether you wanted statehood. You needed to have fiscal responsibility because you can't, long term. So that's the way I viewed it, and that's the way I started my role, my job.
And as the first and former chairman of the Fiscal Oversight Board, can you give us your perspective on Puerto Rico's progress towards restructuring and repayment of the island's debt since the approval of PROMESA? And then also kind of, as you look back, what are the things that you think were done really well, and what are some of the areas where you think things could have been done better?
Right. Well, that's the good news part of the story, is that we are well on our way to resolving the debt issue. I mean, the first tranche that was renegotiated was the COFINA, our sales and tax bonds. That was done under my tenure, and then subsequent, the following board did the general obligation bonds, the GOs. Currently, they're dealing with a very, very difficult situation in the Power Authority, but eventually that will come to an end as well. So as far as the restructuring part, I think that's a success story from the board. The part where the board has not been successful, and that is because of the power that Congress decided to provide the board, is the structural reform component that we all know is necessary and we all pay lip service to, but we don't really move those issues forward. The board can only suggest with studies and with seminars so much. It needs to be legislated by our elected politicians, and that has not been a success. And that has not been a success because um, those are difficult. Those are very difficult. You have to make decisions that could be politically unpopular. And what we thought, we thought that, well, much like Marion Barry Marion Barry in Washington, D.C., and Ed Koch and others in the New York board, that our politicians would use the board as cover to make difficult decisions. And we thought that would be part of what they would do specifically on the structural reform stuff. They did no such thing. They used it as a political cudgel to emphasize their preferred status solution. And that, puts us in a bad spot with regards to that, because we really haven't addressed the structural reform issues.
And there is a component of PROMESA where the board has a function that's supposed to focus on economic development. Can you talk to us about how that played out, and what potential you see for that to still be utilized in a way that's significant?
I'm happy to talk about that. I remember distinctly having conversations in Congress with people who said that they were in the room when the law was being written, and that the law would provide X, Y, and Z, and that we could do, all these things. We litigated all this, and Judge Swain decided that the board has two fundamental powers. One is the budget, and the other is debt restructuring. Now, we're in the midst, and we're finishing up debt restructuring. The budget is a hammer. It's not a knife. You have to, you either do this or I'm going to withhold these funds. It's an imprecise instrument. It's powerful, but it's imprecise. You can't get in there to write. Those things need to be moved forward, as they should be, by the elected officials in our legislature. So these concept of these officials, if you're talking about the Title V official, which we have a good one now in place. He's very involved in economic development issues, and he wants to do the right thing. It's limited. They can propose, they can have conversations, but they can't impose. And it's in that regard, it has proved to be insufficient in that regard. But again, the only way that it could have been were if the board were provided control provisions like they did in DC, which would make it even more anti-democratic. And that was politically not palatable at the time, I suppose, or the decision was made to I wasn't privy to that decision. In fact, I wasn't even privy to the conversations prior to PROMESA. I came in toward the end, to be frank, so that's where I'm not very hopeful, unfortunately, in light of past experience, that we're going to see much economic development out of the board, because economic development is just an integral part of the structural reform that needs to take place.
So now that Puerto Rico's been under PROMESA and the Fiscal Oversight Board for about 8 years, a lot of people are asking, when is that whole process going to end? And as far as I'm aware, Puerto Rico, under the law, is required to attain adequate access to short and long-term credit markets, as well as have 4 consecutive years of balanced budgets, with the expenditures not exceeding revenues. What are the things that you're aware of that are still needing to be fixed for Puerto Rico to be able to finish this process, not just from the debt side, because I think you've already addressed that, but more from the fiscal responsibility side and the access to the credit markets?
So again, the access to the market is not going to be an issue, in my view. There will be people, even people that are unwell, that are willing to provide credit to the lever. So that's not an issue. The issue is how to define the structural budget balanced so that the 4 years of consecutiveness will start, and therefore you will be rid of the oversight board. I think we need a little more clarity, to be frank. And I've had that conversation myself with Robert. I suggested that that the board has that definition, and that it's understood by all the players, because I think it's important that the board not become an institution in Puerto Rico. Having said that, you understand that many politicians are happy to have the board because they can do irresponsible fiscal legislating, like they did in this previous budget. The previous budget was structurally balanced, and then the legislature decided to add 500 million additional because the next they have the jury is still out. The individual motivation, you can that's a question, but that the oversight board will be there to say, no, you can't do that, that's irresponsible. So there's that. And then the business community in Puerto Rico privately is delighted to have the board precisely for that reason. And the politicians, again, are happy to have it, although they want to use it to beat it up, but they can use it as well, I'm going to give you this. I would have given you more, but the oversight board won't let me. There's a lot of that that goes on privately. But I think it's a structural problem, and I think we need to take care of it, because we can't have unelected officials. That's not the way it works. It's not the way it's supposed to be. It's not democratic.
And that democratic deficit, I think, has been one of the key elements that has been brought up over and over about, why the Fiscal Oversight Board is problematic. Yet, under Puerto Rico's current territory status, Congress has, under the U.S. Constitution, the Territories Clause, the right to make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory. So, in your view, as long as Puerto Rico is a territory, can Congress continue to impose the board or some other governance structure, irrespective of the wishes and the votes of the citizens in Puerto Rico?
Yeah, that's what the Constitution says. We are under the Treaty of Paris. We're a ward of Congress, and Congress can do with the territories, according to the Constitution, what they see fit. It's a very my understanding is, last time I saw the language was broad, and they can do what they see fit. Again, in this particular instance, they utilized this vehicle in order to restructure debt, and I think it was necessary. Now, we can't have this going on forever. That's my view, and I think that's the responsible view. We need to be able to govern ourselves responsibly, and I think there's a lot of that. And I think I want to add to your question, because I know it's popular to say, well, Congress should do this and Congress should do that, and they've been terrible to Puerto Rico, blah blah blah. The reality is that we bankrupted ourselves. So we didn't bankrupt ourselves with the help of anybody. We could have taken measures. We could have implemented policy that would have been better from a fiscal perspective, and it was just not coming to play. I often in this conversation, Congress is so vile, and this is terrible. What about personal responsibility?
Yep.
What about collective governmental responsibility? Where's that? Where's that in the conversation? Oh, these politicians, they're terrible. Well, they're terrible, but we keep on electing the same one. So,
no, I agree. I think that there's a definite need to increase the amount of responsibility and accountability for our elected officials and the decisions that they make, and whether it's improving our circumstance so we can finish the process that's laid out under PROMESA, or aspiring to eventually make Puerto Rico a state, or seeking independence with or without free association, achieving fiscal responsibility and having a government that is responsive to and accountable to the needs of its population, the population serving, is absolutely fundamental.
Yeah, that was my premise. I tried to be respectful. I favor statehood, and I tried to be respectful, very particularly of those people that favor independence, because although the vehicle was imperfect, and I manifested that on multiple occasions, my function was not to promote any particular status option. It was to deal with the bankruptcy and to deal with the fiscal responsibility. I didn't understand why people thought that it was so contrary, that they would prefer to keep on down the path of fiscal responsibility and bankruptcy, and to keep on having the circular conversations and circular firing squads, as opposed to just solving the issue, and then you can continue to promote your whatever it is that you want to do. I never understood the anger, and the hate. I had protests and people very, very, difficult insults for me and my family for many years. I had a security detail. Security detail for guys dealing with bankruptcy in the budget. It seemed I didn't realize I would need it until they occupied my office, and I had to think of other people in my circle. It was quite something.
Well, it's interesting, and I think that it's terribly sad that's I think what ended up happening, but I think part of it has to do from a psychological perspective that a lot of the anger and frustration with the powerlessness of the territory status became projected onto the board, and the board itself kind of became an entity that represented that and became the entity upon which a lot of the frustrations with other issues, like lack of accountable governance, and a lot of the local challenges with underinvestment in infrastructure and things like that, became focused there, as well as with the reality that Puerto Rico under territory status is being treated unequally in a number of different dimensions, and that essentially pushes our population to leave. Well, I want to shift just a little bit and maybe go back to an item that we were talking about a little bit earlier. And you mentioned, the Fiscal Oversight Board has a lot of authority, obviously, over the debt restructuring issue and the budgeting issue and the finance issue. But one area where Congress basically kind of carved out is that the Oversight Board is not authorized to restrict Puerto Rico's right to self-determination and to figure out its political future. Having served on the Oversight Board, what do you believe you've learned from that about the efforts to try to resolve Puerto Rico's political status and the prospects of statehood? What did that teach you?
Well, I've become more conservative since I started on the board, so I've made more of a conservative journey in that regard, and that opened my eyes to other conversations that I had not been privy to before. But that's a personal matter. On the board per se, we would be very careful and cognizant to comply with the law and understanding. I would have to many times educate my colleagues from up north as to why certain things were inherently political and dealt with status. Um, everybody saw things so badly that regardless of whether uniformly, because things are so bad from a fiscal and budgetary perspective, that we voted together 100% of the time, save for two events that we didn't vote together, and we were bipartisan. And they were in the board, even amongst the people who were from Puerto Rico, they had different views as to status. We just wanted to deal with the issue that was immediately before us, and I would make it a point to make sure that we didn't infringe in any opportunity that that government or this government, whomever, had in promoting whatever it is they wanted to do. In this particular case, the statehood for Puerto Rico, we didn't because that was in the law, and we respected that from a public policy perspective.
And one concern that I've heard on the island recently by opponents of statehood is that if Puerto Rico were to become a state, the island would end up having one of the highest tax rates, if not the highest tax rates of all the 50 states. And the claim is that the state legislature in Puerto Rico would be unable to change and lower the local and state tax rates because of the duty and the responsibility to repay the outstanding debt and the way that that's been negotiated. What's your perspective on that?
That's not, I mean, that's not the case. The issue of they would be better, their argument would be better served by stating, look, Puerto Rico can lower its tax rate materially tomorrow if they wanted to, and could get ready for statehood and the imposition of federal tax at some point if it chose to do so. Puerto Rico has chosen not to do so because they like to pay for a very large a government that provides quite a few things to people, and the tax incentives and that are not, in my view, entirely justified. You have a very large government. It's decreased, but if you're talking about employing 150,000 people, it used to be 200,000. Maybe it's 125,000 now. Think about that. Again, 78 municipalities, 30 of which are financed by the central government. We have, as you know, one of the largest governments, state governments around. How are you going to pay for these people? How are you going to pay for this infrastructure? That's what the tax rate is for. You want to lower taxes, you're going to have to take a look at the government.
And in your view, what are some of the policies that you think would need to be implemented to allow for the possibility of statehood to be able to come together from a fiscal perspective and taking into account the debt renegotiation that's already happened?
Sure. First of all, that's you take into account the debt negotiation. You have to understand that we are in a pay-as-you-go system for the pension funds. So all the pensions that we've incurred, that we pay on a recurring basis through our taxes. We don't have a pension fund. It was bankrupted. There wasn't any money there. So we had to implement this system. The most important thing that you can do is you generate economic activity by promoting the structural reforms that will create wealth, and that is you can do so by a pointed tax policy, by removing certain laws that impede economic activity, and the labor laws. We have to take a look at that. Our labor laws are particularly onerous. And compared to compare ourselves to people that we compete with, that would be the start. And then that's on the revenue side. And then on the side of what can we do to prepare ourselves? Well, look at our government. We have an inefficient, large government. There's no way to look at it. And you need to look at that seriously. And that begins with looking at how many municipalities do we have, how many
government agencies.
State, yeah. I mean, what's the effect of the top tax rate now is 32, 33%. I can't recall. And you get there quickly. After $66,000. Boom, you're there. So the majority of those folks are asalariados. There's people who are employees. And it's not fair to them either. So I would take a look at those two things to get the island. But again, these issues, we discussed it without me being overly partisan, without me manifesting my particular interest. You wanted to do that which was best for Puerto Rico, so that then Puerto Rico could choose whichever avenue it wanted. That was the goal that we felt we needed to implement. But our politicians, some of them didn't feel otherwise. They just couldn't move themselves because the politics didn't work for them.
Yeah, no, I understand. So now looking at the political landscape that Puerto Rico is currently experiencing, we've got the general election coming up in November. We just had a primary in Puerto Rico's pro-statehood party, the PNP, and it was between a Democrat, Pedro Pierluisi, who was the member of Congress that was in place when PROMESA was approved. In full disclosure, I worked for him during that time. And then we have resident commissioner Jennifer Gonzalez Colon, who is Puerto Rico's current resident commissioner. She's a Republican, and I've collaborated extensively with her in these last couple of years as she's worked to advance status legislation through Congress. So do you have a sense that with Jennifer Gonzalez possibly becoming governor of Puerto Rico in next year, January 2025, if she's successful, as polls are indicating she may be in November, that there's a possibility for more fiscally responsible policies and policies that promote economic growth in the ways that you're indicating to be implemented? And if so, what would those be?
Okay. Full disclosure, I was Pedro's Pierluisi's brother-in-law for 16 years, and he was the attorney for the Oversight Board. We hired him after he lost his first primary. Having said all of that, I supported Jennifer for governor. I am very hopeful that once we get a Republican into power, that she will take a very hard look at things that need to be done that have not been promoted. What does that look like? Permitting. It looks like tax policy, and it looks like promoting personal responsibility, and looking not toward the government to fix all your problems. I think those issues are very important. I think it's very important. I personally believe it's very important for the statehood movement that we have a Republican in power in Puerto Rico, because we are very far removed from today's Republican Party, and I think people need to understand that, and hopefully Jennifer will be able to bridge that gap.
And I think that leads us perfectly into the next question, which is, I know you're a Republican and that you recently participated in the RNC. What are your perspectives about the ongoing transformation within the Republican Party, and how that translates into opportunities or challenges for us to address this issue of resolving Puerto Rico's territory status in the future?
Well, I'm delighted, and I think this is a minority opinion here in Puerto Rico, but I am delighted with the fact that President Trump has has molded the Republican Party into a viable, strong electoral force. I recall back in the day, after the Mitt Romney's loss, that they were writing the tombstone of the Republican Party.
Yeah.
The obituary. The party was becoming exclusively Southern, primarily elitist, country club establishment type. President Trump has turned the party into a working person's party, a nationalistic party who is interested in promoting the interest of the United States, and taking into consideration the American taxpayer and the American worker. I don't see how there could be anything wrong with that. I'm entirely in favor of it, and I am a supporter, and I believe strongly in that. What does that mean for Puerto Rico?
How does Puerto Rico fit into that equation?
Okay, well, we have quite a lot of work to do. We have quite a lot of work to do. I think back in the day when I was coming up, I think I know I'm older than you. We were taught that la estadidad era para los pobres. Statehood was for the poor. That statehood was for the peasants, le jíbaro, la estadidad jíbara. We understand now that under the present situation, we are welcome in the nation. You can see the Republican Party is essentially composed of many races, many people, but they are interested in one thing: what makes you an American? You know, Puerto Rico has to stop playing the best of both worlds argument, and we have to decidedly decide that we want to be American. What does that mean? It means let's become bilingual. Why aren't we teaching our children to speak English? By the way, that's only an issue with people if you don't have any money. My daughter speaks fluent English, and most of my friends, their children, regardless of what they want for Puerto Rico, their children speak English. So why are we teaching our children English? Why do we promote the other? If we want to be Americans, we should be Americans, and there's nothing incompatible about being Puerto Rican and being American, unless you draw a wedge, and then unless you have these things that separate you from the national entity, the national body. And that's my view, and that's the way I feel.
No, I hear you. I was born and raised in Puerto Rico. I went all the way through high school in the local education system, and I was able to learn English and Spanish perfectly. I use both of them professionally, and I think it would be an incredible advantage to everyone to be able to have full bilingual capacity. It's something that adds economic opportunity to you. But when, we're asking, why aren't we teaching English? I think we are in the public school system in Puerto Rico. It's just not very well taught, and we don't have a sufficient focus on it to be able to really make sure that, people have a sufficient level of, mastery of the language so that they can use it in professional settings and also participate in the national political discourse, which is fundamentally important if we want to be full participants.
Which we don't. It's another issue. It's difficult to have a conversation with all but a select group of people regarding national politics and what's happening in we're so insular in that regard that we need to move beyond that. Again, I'm hopeful that with Jennifer we can start moving beyond that, but we have quite a bit of work to do because statehood is on their terms. It's not on our terms. We are seeking to join the union, and that is important. That folks from Arkansas can establish themselves here in Puerto Rico and be able to function. When that day comes, then we'll be closer. And hopefully by then we will have had responsible Republican governance, or at least non-wacko left-wing governance and so we'll be able to say which we know we are, because there many social conservatives and many people who are fiscal conservatives, but you want them to say these are the people that we can elect. And that we could elect into the national. My experience during the time in the Oversight Board was, in private they would talk a good game, but man, publicly they just couldn't get it together. So, we need to start walking the walk, talking the talk and walking the walk.
And if you could share a message with Republicans nationally to help them be more aware of what Puerto Rico has as its potential to contribute more to our country, nationwide, what would you tell your average fellow voter stateside?
Yeah, currently I would be very emphatic on the national security issues that Puerto Rico can provide. Traditionally, historically, Puerto Rico has been the point of the sword, la punta de lanza in defense issues. I think we're going to be seeing more of that as the Chinese and Russian presence in Cuba and in Peru increase. We need to understand that we are the best neighbor that those folks can have because we're Americans. So that's, I think, very important from a national security perspective. I think we need to have that conversation as to what that might look like from a military standpoint. And I think also we could conceivably have play a role in nearshoring that would be beneficial to both the territory and the nation if we had the appropriate policy in place. I think that would be beneficial to the nation as a whole. To the degree that, look, I think this is also part of the mindset that we need to have. It needs to be part of the conversation. We cannot just be folks who are out for more federal funds, right? We have to add value to the nation, right? We have to be people who the nation says these are partners, these are folks, we want them in the tent, right? And for that we need to be on our feet, and we need to be of value. We need to be less of a burden to the taxpayers of Kansas, or you choose your. And I think that's important. And our people need to understand, and this is something that our leaders need to do. That when they say FEMA, or when they say something, we're talking about somebody, flesh and blood, is paying their taxes into a fund that provides that for Puerto Rico. So I want to state that as well. But I would focus on those issues.
One of the things that this makes me think is that when I worked in the government of Puerto Rico, and throughout my professional experience working on U.S. Puerto Rico federal policy issues, there's a challenge, because the current territory status sets Puerto Rico up in a way where for some things we're treated at the federal level as if we're a state. For some things we're treated as if we were a foreign country, at least for certain purposes. And then locally, you have the same circumstance where, some levels of governance, they're trying to further integrate Puerto Rico into the national economy, into the national body politic. And, other political parties and other levels of governance, they want to pretend that Puerto Rico's something separate and independent and get an exception for everything. So, one of the things that I always come back to is that, there's a huge potential benefit beyond the benefit that America's already getting from Puerto Rico. Because right now, I think a lot of people don't realize this, but, Puerto Rico has about $70-some billion worth of interstate commerce with the United States. That's a lot of money, a lot of jobs that are being created stateside, out of the, consumers in Puerto Rico. And likewise, consumers and producers in Puerto Rico are being able to ship and sell goods stateside. But you can't ever optimize the island's economic potential until you have a clear idea of which direction you're going, because optimizing Puerto Rico's politics and policies to maximize its economy under statehood looks very different than the type of policies that you would pursue if you wanted to maximize Puerto Rico's economy as an independent country.
I understand what you're saying, and I agree with you. And I'm not. You don't become a republic if the people here so chose to do so, or you don't become a state from one day to the next. It's a process, and I understand that you need to prepare for the eventuality that be the case, and that requires a serious and comprehensive discussion with the federal government and with the state government that encompasses, taxes to federal programs, all sorts of things. So yeah, no, I understand that. I would point out something that is happening here in Puerto Rico. A newspaper, the latest poll, had the territorial party, the people who favor the Commonwealth, which is the territorial party, they're coming third in the election. Okay, you have the statehood party coming in first with 40%, and you have the independent socialist left-wing party coming in at 20-some odd percent. Be careful. The statehood party has polarized the electorate, and now we don't favor, or we don't look to the territorial government. It's a passing. It's no longer something that's valid for us. And now the choice is between a left-wing, anti-American entity, polity, and the statehood government. That's new, and in my view, as a business person in Puerto Rico, worrisome.
Yeah.
Because look, the territory is a territory with its multiple defects. But you know what? You look out the window, Old Glory is flying outside, right? And there's always the hope that if things go the way that they need to go, that we'll become a state. but Old Glory is there, and the federal court is down here. That's material, and it's important, particularly to some form of stability, because you'd need to work with that status, that polity, in order to go to your point. So I'm wary, and I am concerned that we're losing as an alternative the territory. You're not going to get that on your statehood podcast, but I just said it.
Yeah, no, I hear what you're saying. Constitutionally, it continues to be an alternative. I think the reality, though, is that if Puerto Rico continues to lose population, then the prospects for economic growth are shot. And under the current territory status, there'll always be greener grass on the other side, and unfortunately, that's a structural problem that diminishes your workforce, it diminishes your consumer demand, it diminishes your tax base. So it kind of kills you economically across the board, which is why I think more and more we're reaching a moment where it's a get it, make it, or break it moment, right?
Sure. Well, here the electorate apparently agrees with you.
Interesting. So, last thoughts. What recommendation and advice would you give supporters of statehood for Puerto Rico, whether on the island or stateside, to be able to help this issue gain greater visibility at the national level? How do we break through this kind of barrier of invisibility that has limited this issue from being able to get sufficient attention so it can be, fully addressed in Congress and at the level that it needs to?
I would do two things. Well, three things. The first thing is I would elect Republicans in Puerto Rico. Real Republicans, not just people who manifest themselves as Republicans. And again, I think we're well positioned with regards to Jennifer, and I hope she chooses a team that reflects her priorities and reflects prudent conservative governance. The second issue is I would, we are conservative Republicans are constitutional conservatives. Okay, the United States, okay, is not meant to hold territories. It is a republic, if you can keep it. And as such, the territorial issue is something that needs to be addressed in those forums with constitutional conservatives to open that conversation, to open that front and say, look, this isn't meant to be, a permanent solution. This is a situation that moves you to one or the other. So I think that's an integral part of the conversation, And the third part is you have to recognize the reality, of the current Republican National Party and understand that it is a Trump party, and you have to understand that a loyalty and support to President Trump is material because, people like us want him to be the next president of the United States. We'd like to see a lot more of that in Puerto Rico. Interestingly enough, the delegates that were there that represented Puerto Rico, I was very surprised and enthused by the equality of the folks that were there supporting. So that's good news. But we'd like to see more of that in our elected class. We just don't, and I think that's a reality. And it's a shame because a lot of people, there's a lot of social conservatives that favor Trump, and no one has, from an elected perspective, manifested their support. And I'm wary of that. So I think those three things are important to move the issue forward in today's Republican Party.
Understood. Well, thank you so much, Jose. Are there any closing thoughts or anything else you'd like to share with our audience?
No. It was a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the opportunity.